My name is Ezekiel Whitaker, power line technician from Missouri. 1 month ago, volcanic ash blacked out the sun and plunged Earth into a global ice age. I watched as darkness swallowed the summer sky, temperatures dropped to -30, and people died in their own homes. This is how my technical skills kept 7 survivors alive when the power grid failed and the government abandoned us. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Ezekiel Whitaker. I was a high-voltage power line technician for Midwest Electric Grid Solutions. I say was because that job no longer exists. Nothing from before exists anymore. I'm recording this as a record of what happened, how we survived, and maybe to help others who might find this. It all started 32 days ago. Mid-July, middle of summer. I was driving to Chicago with 3 colleagues for an electrical infrastructure conference. We were actually excited about it, if you can believe that. New grid stabilization technologies, emergency response protocols, boring stuff that ended up mattering more than anyone could have imagined. The morning started perfectly normal. Clear blue skies, temperature in the high 80s. We were about 30 miles outside Des Moines when the first reports came in. Martinez was driving and I was half listening to the radio. The announcer's voice changed mid-sentence, that professional calm cracking just slightly as he described simultaneous volcanic eruptions across the Pacific Ring of Fire. I remember laughing. Actually laughing and telling Martinez that the conspiracy nuts were finally having their day. He didn't laugh back. Instead, he pointed at the western horizon where dark clouds were spreading like spilled ink across the sky. "That's not normal," he said. The radio reports kept coming in. Indonesia, Japan, Alaska, Chile, all experiencing unprecedented volcanic activity within hours of each other. The geologists they interviewed seemed confused, saying this kind of synchronized eruption had no precedent in recorded history. But they weren't panicking yet. They were calling it a fascinating anomaly. By the time we crossed into Illinois 3 hours later, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. We stopped at a gas station to refuel and grab lunch. The place was unusually crowded. Everyone was talking about the weather, how strange it was for July to suddenly feel like October. The TV in the corner of the diner section was showing footage of the eruptions. Massive plumes of ash climbing higher than anyone had ever seen, spreading out in the upper atmosphere. That's when one of the scientific experts on the TV used the term volcanic winter for the first time. I remember because Jimenez, our junior tech, asked me what that meant. "It's when volcanic ash blocks out sunlight," I told him. "Temperature drops, plants struggle, shorter growing seasons. Happened after Krakatoa in 1883. What I didn't tell him was that I'd read about theories that massive volcanic activity might have caused several extinction events in Earth's history. By afternoon, the sky had turned a sickly, yellowish gray. The sun was just a dim circle behind the haze. The temperature kept dropping. We debated turning around heading back to Des Moines, but reports were coming in that the whole Midwest was experiencing the same conditions. Martinez decided we should press on to Chicago where the infrastructure was better. That was the last normal decision we made. The last time we thought this was just unusual weather and not the end of the world as we knew it. 4 hours later, we were 30 miles outside of a small town called Millfield, Illinois. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees in July. Traffic on Interstate 80 had slowed to a crawl. Emergency alerts kept buzzing on our phones. Stay indoors, conserve fuel, prepare for rapidly declining temperatures. Then it started to snow. Light flurries at first, but soon getting heavier. Summer snow. People were getting out of their cars holding out their hands in disbelief. I saw a woman in flip-flops and shorts standing on the shoulder shivering violently while recording the snow on her phone. The traffic stopped completely an hour later. Highway Patrol came through telling everyone to shut off their engines to conserve fuel. They said the backup extended for 20 miles. No one was moving anywhere. I need to tell you about our truck, because it ended up saving lives. It wasn't just any vehicle. It was a utility response truck, fully equipped for emergency power restoration. We had tools, spare parts, high-voltage safety gear, insulated clothing for working in all weather conditions, emergency rations, even a small generator. Standard equipment for line workers who might get stranded during storm response. We never imagined we'd be using it like this. By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted to 28 degrees. The snow was several inches deep and still coming down. Martinez kept trying to call his wife in Kansas City, but the networks were overloaded. None of us could get through to family. The first real sign that this wasn't just a freak weather event came around 7 that evening. Highway Patrol returned, going car to car. They weren't telling people to conserve fuel anymore. They were telling people to abandon vehicles that didn't have enough gas to idle all night. The temperature was expected to drop below zero by morning. Below zero. In July. People started to panic. Most were dressed for summer. Many didn't have more than a light jacket in their car. The patrol officers were directing people to consolidate into vehicles with the most fuel to share body heat. That's when Martinez made the call. "We're power crew. We've got gear. We need to help." We started distributing our spare insulated coveralls, gloves, and emergency blankets to people in nearby cars. We fired up our generator and set up a charging station for phones. People gathered around like it was a campfire. A family with young kids took shelter in our truck's cab. They'd been headed to a summer camp in Wisconsin, had nothing but swimsuits and light clothing. The kids were blue-lipped and shivering when we found them. Throughout the night, we monitored the radio. The news kept getting worse. The eruptions were continuing. The ash cloud was spreading globally. Temperatures were dropping everywhere. Government officials urged calm but recommended that people prepare for extended cold conditions. I noticed one critical detail on our truck's weather station. The temperature wasn't just low, it was still falling. Steady, unnatural decline. By dawn, it had reached 5 degrees. 5 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of July in Illinois. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained dark. Just a dim, filtered light. No real sunrise. Just darkness becoming slightly less dark. That morning, we saw the first death. An elderly couple in a sedan about 50 yards ahead of us. They'd run out of gas during the night. Highway Patrol found them frozen in their seats, holding hands. That's when the true horror of our situation started to sink in. People weren't just unprepared for winter in July. They were unprepared for a winter more severe than any in recent memory, with no infrastructure ready to support it. Martinez and I had a quiet conversation while Jimenez and Torres were distributing the last of our emergency rations to nearby cars. "This isn't stopping," Martinez said. "We need to get off this highway." He was right. The road was a death trap. Thousands of people stranded, limited resources, dropping temperatures. Reports were coming in of the National Guard deploying, but it was clear they couldn't reach everyone in time. We made the decision to abandon our original destination. Chicago would be chaos. Instead, we'd head to the nearest small town, somewhere with fewer people, somewhere we might be able to find shelter and pool resources. As we prepared to leave, I looked west down the highway. Through a brief thinning in the clouds, I saw something that chilled me more than the cold. The entire horizon was black. Not night black, but something worse. A wall of darkness advancing toward us. More ash. Thicker, heavier than before. "We need to move now," I told the others. And we did. Little did I know that our decision to head to Millfield would determine who lived and who died in the coming days. Little did I know that my technical skills as a power line worker were about to become the most valuable currency in a world where heat meant life and cold meant death. We got everyone moving as quickly as possible. The family with the young kids we'd sheltered overnight decided to come with us. The father, Michael, had been a paramedic before switching to pharmaceutical sales. His medical knowledge would prove invaluable later. His wife, Dana, and their 2 children, Emma, 8, and Tyler, 6, were already showing signs of hypothermia despite our best efforts to keep them warm. Getting off the highway was harder than we anticipated. The shoulder was packed with abandoned vehicles. Martinez managed to navigate our truck through by driving partially on the median. The kids were terrified, and I don't blame them. The normal world had vanished overnight, replaced by this frozen nightmare. About a mile from the exit, we passed a roadside diner. The parking lot was full and people were crowded inside, visible through the windows. Martinez pulled in. We needed information, maybe some hot food if they were still cooking. The scene inside the diner was surreal. Every table was full, people standing shoulder to shoulder. The waitstaff had given up on taking orders and were just distributing coffee and whatever food they could prepare. The kitchen staff looked exhausted, like they'd been working nonstop. TV screens showed news coverage from around the world. The same scenes everywhere. Snow falling in Rome, Madrid, Tokyo, Cairo. Places that never saw snow were white. The scientific community was in shock. This wasn't just freak weather, it was potentially catastrophic climate disruption. The volcanic ash had spread faster and higher than any models had predicted. I overheard a dozen different theories from people in the diner: government weather control experiments, divine punishment, alien interference. Everyone was searching for an explanation that made sense of the senseless. I approached the counter where a middle-aged woman was pouring coffee with shaking hands. Her name tag read Diane. "How long can you keep operating?" I asked her. "Gas stoves," she replied, "will cook until the food runs out or the propane does. Most folks here have nowhere else to go." She told me that many of the customers had been there since yesterday. The local motels were full. Some people were sleeping in their cars in the parking lot, coming in during the day to warm up. I asked about the nearest town. "Millfield. About 7 miles east. They've opened the high school as a shelter." She looked at our utility company jackets. "You boys work on the power lines?" When I nodded, her expression changed. "They'll want to talk to you in Millfield. Power's been flickering since last night." We took some coffee and sandwiches to go. As we were leaving, I noticed an older man watching us from the corner booth. He had the weathered look of a farmer, and he was one of the few people not talking or looking at screens. He was just watching, assessing. Something about his calm amid the chaos stuck with me. Back in the truck, we shared what little food we had with the family. That's when I realized Martinez hadn't been able to reach his wife. None of us had made contact with our families. The cell networks were completely overwhelmed, and the few calls that went through didn't stay connected long enough for real conversation. The drive to Millfield was slow and tense. The roads were already icing over, and other vehicles had slid into ditches. We passed a car rolled onto its side, no emergency responders in sight. Martinez wanted to stop, but we didn't see any movement inside, and we had children with us who needed shelter soon. That's when I saw it. A large, rural hardware store just outside town limits. The parking lot was chaos, people fighting over carts, loading up supplies. I made mental note of the location, and that place would have tools, materials, possibly fuel, things we might need if this situation continued. "We should come back here," I told Martinez quietly, "once we know what we're dealing with." Millfield itself was a typical small Midwestern town, Main Street with shops, residential neighborhoods spreading outward, grain silos visible on the horizon. Under normal circumstances, It might have been picturesque. Now it looked like a disaster zone. People were hurrying through the streets carrying supplies. Some stores had already been boarded up. Others had lines stretching around the block. Following the directions from the diner, we made our way to the high school. The parking lot was filled with vehicles, including police cars and an ambulance. National Guard trucks were unloading supplies at the gymnasium entrance. Inside was organized chaos. The gym had been transformed into an emergency shelter, with cots arranged in rows. Volunteers were distributing blankets and setting up privacy screens. A makeshift medical area had been established in one corner, where a doctor and 2 nurses were treating people. We were greeted by a harried-looking woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as the vice principal. When she saw our utility company jackets, her expression changed, just like Diane's had. "You work for the power company? Thank God. We've been trying to get through to someone. The power keeps going out." Torres explained that we weren't local crew, but we could certainly help assess the situation. The vice principal immediately pulled out her phone to call someone, then cursed when she saw there was no signal. She dispatched a student volunteer to find the mayor. While waiting, we got the family settled on some cots. Emma and Tyler were still unusually quiet, clinging to their parents. I gave them my spare gloves, which were comically large on their small hands, but better than nothing. The temperature inside the gym was concerning. Despite being full of people, it couldn't have been more than 50 degrees. The building's heating system wasn't designed for the extreme cold outside, which had now dropped below 0 according to the wall thermometer. A middle-aged man in a police uniform approached us, introducing himself as Chief Williams. With him was a younger man in plain clothes who turned out to be Mayor Harris. "We're dealing with rolling blackouts," the mayor explained. "The grid is overwhelmed with everyone running heaters. The substation on the edge of town keeps tripping offline." Martinez volunteered us immediately. "We can take a look. We've got tools and safety gear in our truck." Chief Williams nodded. "I'll take you there myself. This whole town depends on keeping the heat on tonight." Before leaving, I checked on the family again. Michael had been recruited to help at the medical station. Dana assured me they would be fine for a few hours. I promised to return soon. Outside, the cold hit like a physical blow. It had to be 15 below 0 by now, with a wind that cut through every layer of clothing. The police cruiser's thermometer confirmed it, -17. On the drive to the substation, Chief Williams filled us in on what they knew. The town's population was about 5,000, but the shelter already held nearly 800 people, with more arriving hourly. The grocery stores were running low. The town's small hospital was overwhelmed, and the forecast, what little they could get, predicted temperatures dropping to 30 below by nightfall. "If we lose power completely," he said, "people will start dying." The substation was a standard setup servicing the town and surrounding rural areas. Torres and Jimenez went to check the equipment while Martinez and I spoke with the 2 local utility workers who were already there. The problem was simple, but severe. The demand was exceeding capacity. Every home and business was running heating at maximum. The system wasn't designed for this level of sustained usage in summer. Components were overheating despite the freezing air temperature. We helped implement a more structured rolling blackout system, keeping power to the critical infrastructure, the school, hospital, water treatment plant, while cycling it through different sectors of town. It wasn't a solution, but it would prevent a catastrophic failure of the entire grid. By the time we returned to the school, night had fallen, though it was hard to tell with the perpetual gray haze. The temperature outside had dropped to 25 below. Inside, the gym was cooler than before, maybe 45 degrees now. The atmosphere had changed too. Fear was palpable. More people had arrived, many with frightening stories of being stranded or narrowly escaping freezing homes. An older woman had died of a heart attack an hour earlier, and they'd moved her body to a classroom to keep it from demoralizing the others. I found Dana and the kids huddled under blankets. Michael was still helping at the medical station. "It's getting colder in here," Dana whispered, not wanting the children to hear her concern. "What's happening out there?" I told her the truth. The volcanic ash was blocking the sun globally. Temperatures would continue to drop. The power grid was struggling. No one knew how long these conditions would last. "But we have skills," I assured her. "We know how to keep systems running, how to adapt. We'll get through this." I wasn't sure I believed it myself, but I needed her to believe it for her children's sake. That first night in the shelter, I hardly slept. The cold, the crying children, the occasional shouts or arguments, all kept me alert and anxious. But it was the conversation I overheard between two National Guardsmen that truly chilled me. "Command says this isn't temporary," one said quietly to the other. "The models are showing months, maybe years of this." "What about evacuation?" the other asked. "To where?" "It's global. They're pulling us back to secure the strategic locations. We'll be leaving tomorrow." The government was already abandoning small towns like Millfield. We were on our own. Dawn came as just a slight lightening of the gray haze outside. The temperature in the gym had dropped to near freezing despite the hundreds of bodies generating heat. People were huddled in groups under whatever blankets they could find, breath visible in the cold air. I sought out Chief Williams and found him in what had been the principal's office, now converted to a command center. Maps of the town were spread across the desk, marked with notes about power distribution and resources. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. "Power's still cycling," he told me, "but we lost the east side grid entirely around 3 in the morning. Lines couldn't handle the load." Martinez and Torres volunteered to check it out, while Jimenez and I stayed to help maintain the school systems. The building had an emergency generator, but it was designed to run lights and essential functions, not heat for hundreds of people. The school janitor, an older man named Frank, found me inspecting the boiler room. He watched quietly for a moment before speaking. "That system wasn't built for this," he said. 30 years I've worked here. Never seen it strained like this." I nodded, making calculations about efficiency and heat loss. "There's an old coal furnace," Frank added, "in the basement of the library downtown. They sealed it up in the 90s when they converted to electric, but it's still there. Cast iron monster that heated that whole building for decades." I looked at him with new interest. "Is there still coal?" "Small storage room next to it. Not much, but some. Town used to order it as backup until about 10 years ago." I filed that information away. A coal furnace could be invaluable if the power situation worsened. By midday, the scene at the shelter had become increasingly desperate. More people continued to arrive, many showing signs of exposure. The medical team was overwhelmed. Food was being strictly rationed, 1 small meal per person served at noon. The National Guard soldiers were still present, but I noticed they were consolidating equipment, loading some of their supplies back into trucks. The conversation I'd overheard hadn't been a nightmare. They really were preparing to leave. I found myself recruited to help fix the kitchen's gas stoves, which were struggling in the cold. While working, I overheard the cafeteria staff discussing food supplies. They had perhaps 3 days' worth at current numbers, less if more people arrived. The mayor called an impromptu meeting with town officials and anyone with relevant skills. About 20 of us gathered in the library where Mayor Harris laid out the situation without sugarcoating it. "The National Guard has been ordered to withdraw by tomorrow morning," he confirmed. "They're being deployed to secure critical infrastructure in major cities. We're on our own." He looked around the room. "I need honest assessments. How long can we sustain these people?" The reports were grim. Power was failing faster than it could be repaired. Food supplies were critical. Medication for chronic conditions was running out. The hospital generator was functioning, but fuel was limited. And the temperature continued to drop. A meteorologist from the local TV station spoke up. "Based on what data I can access, this is unprecedented. The volcanic ash has created a global cooling effect more severe than any models predicted. We're looking at a volcanic winter scenario that could last months, possibly years." He explained what this meant. The ash was reflecting sunlight back into space, preventing it from warming the Earth's surface. Until the ash dissipated or settled, temperatures would remain far below normal. I spoke up then, explaining what we'd observed at the substation and the limitations of the current power infrastructure. The grid wasn't designed for this level of demand. Components are failing faster than they can be replaced. Even with rolling blackouts, I estimate total failure within days, not weeks. The meeting ended with more questions than answers. The mayor asked for volunteers to form teams focused on specific needs: power, food, medical, security. I joined the power team naturally. Throughout the afternoon, emergency broadcasts came through on the school's radio. The information was increasingly alarming. Major cities were implementing martial law. Power grids were failing across the country. Roads were impassable in many areas due to snow and abandoned vehicles. And the temperature continued to drop nationally, globally. A scientist being interviewed explained that we were experiencing a positive feedback loop. The colder it got, the more energy people used for heating, causing more grid failures, leading to more deaths, fewer repair personnel, more failures, and so on. She used the phrase cascade failure to describe what was happening to our infrastructure. By evening, the first true signs of panic began to emerge at the shelter. A fight broke out over blankets, and then another over food. The local police were outnumbered and struggling to maintain order. Some people were talking about leaving, trying to reach larger cities where they believed help would be more forthcoming. I sought out my colleagues. Martinez and Torres had returned from their repair attempt, unsuccessful and frostbitten. Jimenez was helping a group of elderly residents stay warm by creating a sheltered area with tarps to contain body heat. "We need to think about our next move," I told them quietly. "This situation is deteriorating fast." Martinez nodded grimly. I overheard the guard talking. They're leaving at first light, and they're not optimistic about the government's response plans. This is too big, too widespread. I shared what Frank had told me about the library's coal furnace. It's a better structure anyway. Brick construction, smaller windows, easier to heat. If we could get a small group there with the right supplies. We were interrupted by the lights flickering, then going out completely. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps, cries, some screams from children. Emergency lights came on, casting eerie shadows. The backup generator had kicked in, but it was only powering essential systems, not heat. Chief Williams called for calm using a battery-powered megaphone. He explained that the outage was temporary, part of the rolling blackout system. Power would return within an hour. But I knew different. When I checked with the maintenance team, they confirmed my fears. The main transformer for this section of town had failed completely. The high school was now running solely on generator power, which would last perhaps 48 hours if fuel was strictly conserved. That night, the temperature inside the gym dropped below freezing. People were sleeping in shifts, some staying awake to exercise and generate body heat, then switching with others. The medical area reported its first deaths from hypothermia. 2 elderly residents and a child with a pre-existing condition. I couldn't sleep, instead walking the halls, checking equipment, making mental notes of useful supplies. In the home economics classroom, I found cabinets full of sewing materials. In the science labs, chemical hand warmers, and Bunsen burners. In the maintenance closets, tools that could be repurposed, I was creating an inventory for survival. Around midnight, I found myself in the school's library systematically going through reference books on electricity, engineering, and survival. If we were going to make it through this, we needed knowledge as much as supplies. I was so absorbed that I almost didn't notice when the radio on the librarian's desk crackled to life. The emergency broadcast system was issuing a new alert. This is not a test. The President has declared a state of national emergency. All citizens are advised to shelter in place. Conservation of resources is mandatory. Due to widespread infrastructure damage, federal response will prioritize strategic locations and population centers. Citizens in outlying areas should prepare for extended isolation. The message repeated then gave way to a scientist explaining the volcanic winter phenomenon in more detail. He confirmed what we already feared. This wasn't a short-term event. The sulfur dioxide and ash from the multiple eruptions had created an aerosol layer in the stratosphere that could persist for years, causing global temperature drops of 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit on average, with more extreme drops in some regions. He used the phrase extinction-level event before being cut off by the host. I returned to the gym to find Chief Williams and Mayor Harris in intense discussion. They nodded for me to join them. "We're implementing evacuation protocols," the mayor said. "The National Guard will take as many people as possible when they leave tomorrow. Children, elderly, and medical priorities first." "To where?" I asked. "Military bases and designated FEMA shelters in major cities," Chief Williams replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't convinced of their viability either. "And the rest of us?" The mayor looked grim. "We're on our own until help comes. If it comes." That was the moment I truly understood. The world I had known was gone. Whatever came next would be determined not by governments or institutions, but by how individuals and small groups adapted to a fundamentally altered planet. I returned to my spot near the heating vent that no longer produced heat. Martinez was awake, staring at the ceiling. "We need to make our own plans," I whispered. "Tomorrow." He nodded without looking at me. "I know. Power. That was what I understood. And in this new frozen world, power meant life." The next morning brought the news we'd been dreading. The main power grid had failed completely overnight. Multiple substations had gone offline, and the transmission lines from the regional power plant had collapsed under the weight of ice. The school was running entirely on generator power now, which was being reserved for the most critical needs: some lighting and the kitchen's gas stoves. Temperature inside the gym had dropped to 25 degrees. People were visibly suffering, huddled together in groups, many showing signs of hypothermia despite our best efforts. The medical station reported 3 more deaths overnight. The National Guard began loading people onto their trucks around 7 in the morning. The scene was heartbreaking. Families were being separated. Children and elderly sent with the convoy, while adults were told they'd have to wait for the next evacuation. Some refused to be separated, choosing to stay together despite the risks. Others fought desperately to get spots on the trucks. I helped load Michael and Dana's children, Emma and Tyler, onto one of the trucks. Dana went with them, but Michael chose to stay to continue helping with medical care. The look on his face as he watched his family leave was something I'll never forget. A mixture of relief that they might be safer and terror that he might never see them again. By noon, the National Guard was gone, taking about 200 people with them, less than a quarter of the shelter's population. They left behind some supplies and the crushing acknowledgement that no more help was coming anytime soon. Mayor Harris called another meeting, this time with only the emergency committee. The situation had deteriorated beyond their worst projections. The generator fuel would last another day at most. Food supplies for those remaining would stretch to perhaps 4 days with severe rationing, and the temperature outside had reached 35 degrees below zero. "We need to disperse," Chief Williams suggested. "Smaller groups in separate locations. Concentrate resources where they'll do the most good." There was resistance to this idea. People were scared, and the shelter represented safety in numbers. But the math was undeniable. The school building was too large, too difficult to heat, and too resource-intensive to maintain for hundreds of people with no power. The plan that emerged was to identify several smaller, more insulated buildings around town that could serve as secondary shelters. People with medical needs would remain at the school with the generator. Others would relocate based on proximity to their homes or specific skills they could contribute. I pulled Martinez, Torres, and Jimenez aside after the meeting. "We need to check out that library," I told them. "The coal furnace could be our best chance at sustainable heat." Before we could leave, though, a new crisis erupted. The generator failed, a mechanical issue rather than fuel depletion. The school was plunged into darkness and, more critically, total cold. People panicked. In the chaos that followed, fights broke out. Some began grabbing whatever supplies they could carry and fleeing. Others barricaded themselves in classrooms with what food or blankets they'd managed to secure. Chief Williams and his remaining officers tried to maintain order, but they were overwhelmed. I saw one officer get knocked unconscious by someone desperate to take his coat and weapon. That was when I made the decision that would shape everything that followed. I gathered our team and a few others who seemed level-headed: Michael the paramedic, Frank the janitor, a retired mechanical engineer named Patricia, and a young woman named Aisha who had been helping organize supplies. "We're heading to the town library," I told them. "There's a coal furnace there that might still work. We'll need tools, food, whatever medical supplies we can carry, and anything that can be burned for fuel if the coal runs out." We moved quickly, collecting what we could without drawing too much attention. The scene in the gym was deteriorating rapidly. Mayor Harris was trying to restore order, but his voice was being drowned out by the growing panic. As we prepared to leave, Michael hesitated. "There are people here who will die without medical attention," he said. I understood his conflict. "Bring whoever you think has a chance and needs it most," I told him. "But we have limited resources. Hard choices have to be made." In the end, he identified 3 patients he believed could be transported and had survivable conditions: an insulin-dependent diabetic, a man with a broken leg that needed proper setting, and a pregnant woman in her second trimester who was showing signs of hypothermia. We left through the rear entrance of the school, loading our supplies into our utility truck and an SUV Patricia had managed to keep running. The cold outside was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, an aggressive, hostile force that seemed to seek out any exposed skin. Even breathing was painful, the air so cold it burned the lungs. The drive to the library took only minutes, but it felt like crossing an alien landscape. The streets were buried under snowdrifts, abandoned cars half visible like shipwrecks. The few people we saw were running from building to building, bundled beyond recognition. The library was a 2-story brick building from the 1930s, with small windows and a solid construction that had weathered nearly a century of Midwestern seasons. The doors were locked, but Frank had keys to most town buildings from his maintenance work. Inside it was dark and nearly as cold as outside, but critically, it was sheltered from the wind. We immediately set about securing the building, closing window blinds, blocking drafts, creating a smaller area within the main reading room that could be more efficiently heated. Frank led us to the basement where we found the old coal furnace, a massive cast-iron beast covered in decades of dust. Next to it was a small storage room with perhaps half a ton of coal, enough for several days if used conservatively. Getting the furnace operating was a challenge. The chimney needed clearing, components needed cleaning, and the whole system had to be carefully checked for safety. While Frank, Torres, and Patricia worked on this, the rest of us organized our supplies and explored the building for anything useful. The library proved to be an excellent choice. The basement included a staff break room with a small kitchen. The building had its own water tank, which was still partially full, though starting to freeze. The book collection itself represented an invaluable resource, practical knowledge on everything from agriculture to medicine to engineering. I found Aisha in the reference section, gathering books on wilderness survival, power generation, and cold weather living. I was a history major, she explained, focused on pioneer settlements. Never thought I'd be living it. By evening, we had managed the impossible. The coal furnace was operational, heating the basement and a portion of the first floor that we had isolated from the rest of the building using plastic sheeting and bookshelves. The temperature in our living space rose to a nearly comfortable 40 degrees. That first night in the library, a group of 12 huddled in the makeshift warm zone, eating cold rations and taking stock of our situation. The pregnant woman, Sarah, was responding well to the warmth. The diabetic, Ron, had enough insulin for perhaps 2 weeks. The man with the broken leg, whose name was David, was in pain but stable after Michael had properly set and splinted his injury. We established watches through the night, both to maintain the furnace and to keep an eye out for others who might discover our relatively comfortable sanctuary. The town had dissolved into small groups seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Some had broken into homes or businesses. Gunshots had been heard twice since sundown. I took the first watch, sitting near the coal furnace, feeling its radiant heat while monitoring the chimney for proper draw. The basement windows gave a limited view of the street, where occasional shadows moved through the darkness, people still searching for shelter in the deadly cold. Frank joined me a few hours into my watch. He was older than the rest of us, probably in his 60s, with the leathery hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with tools. That school would have been a death trap, he said quietly. Too big, too many people, not enough resources. I nodded. This place, he continued, might work. Small enough to heat, solid construction, and there's something else you should know. He gestured toward a door we hadn't yet explored. Storage room. There's an old ham radio setup the library used to maintain for emergencies. Hasn't been used in years, but it might still work. I looked at Frank with new appreciation. A radio could be invaluable for gathering information, potentially contacting other survivors or emergency services, if any were still operating. You're thinking ahead, I said. Good. He shrugged. Got granddaughters out there somewhere. Have to believe they're surviving too. That night, as I eventually tried to sleep on a makeshift bed of cushions from reading chairs, I realized we had crossed a threshold. The world we knew was gone. Whether this volcanic winter lasted months or years, nothing would ever be the same. We'd entered a new reality where each day would be defined by the basic struggle to maintain heat, food, and safety. But we had something valuable: skills, knowledge, the ability to adapt. And perhaps most importantly, we had found each other, a small group of capable people who understood what needed to be done. Tomorrow we would face new challenges. We needed to secure more food, establish better security, explore the radio's potential, and assess whether we could bring in more survivors. Outside, the temperature continued to drop as ash obscured the stars. Inside, the coal furnace glowed, keeping death at bay for another night. I woke to the sound of hushed arguments. Martinez and Torres were discussing our dwindling coal supply with Frank. At the current burn rate, we had perhaps 3 days left. We needed to find more fuel immediately. I joined their conversation, suggesting we organize a scavenging mission to the hardware store I'd noticed when we first entered town. It likely had materials we could burn: wood, coal, maybe even kerosene heaters. It's going to be dangerous out there, Martinez warned. People are desperate. He was right, but we had no choice. We assembled a team of 4, Martinez, Torres, myself, and Patricia, who insisted on coming because she knew the store owner. We armed ourselves with tools that could serve as weapons if needed. A crowbar for me, a hammer for Martinez, wrenches for the others. The temperature outside had somehow dropped even further overnight. The thermometer in our truck read -40. At these temperatures, exposed skin could freeze in minutes. We dressed in layers, covering every inch of skin, using scarves as improvised face masks. The drive to the hardware store was tense. The streets were eerily empty, but we could see smoke rising from chimneys and occasionally shadows moving behind windows. People were bunkering down wherever they could find shelter. The hardware store parking lot contained several abandoned vehicles, some with frost-covered windows that suggested their occupants might still be inside. We approached cautiously. The front doors were locked but showed signs of attempted forced entry. Patricia led us around to the back where she knew of a side entrance. It, too, was locked, but the door frame had begun to warp from the extreme cold, creating gaps we could exploit. Torres managed to force it open with minimal damage. Inside, the store was dark and cold, but undisturbed. It seemed we were the first to break in. We moved quickly, using flashlights sparingly to avoid drawing attention from outside. The store was a treasure trove of survival supplies: tools, tarps, rope, batteries, lanterns. But most valuable to us were the heating supplies: bags of coal, kerosene heaters, propane tanks, and wood. We were loading our first haul into the truck when we heard an engine approaching. Headlights swept across the front of the store. We froze, waiting in the darkness of the loading dock. A pickup truck parked, and 3 men got out, carrying what looked like hunting rifles. They approached the front doors and began attempting to break in. "We should go now," Torres whispered. "We have enough for a few days." He was right, but I was thinking longer term. The store contained supplies that could mean life or death in the coming weeks. We couldn't afford to let others claim them all. I made a quick decision. "Patricia, you and Torres take what we've loaded back to the library. Martinez and I will get more and find another way out." They left quietly, while Martinez and I returned inside. We worked methodically, gathering more fuel, tools, batteries, water purification supplies, and anything else that seemed essential for long-term survival. We were nearly finished when we heard glass breaking at the front of the store. The men had gotten in. Martinez and I retreated to the storage room, hoping to wait them out or find another exit. Through a crack in the door, we could see them moving through the store, taking some of the same supplies we had targeted. They were methodical, too, clearly focused on survival items rather than valuables. One of them approached the counter and found the store's logbook. He flipped through it and pointed something out to the others. They nodded and headed toward the back of the store, directly toward us. Martinez tensed, gripping his hammer. I put a hand on his arm and shook my head. Violence would only lead to more violence, and we couldn't afford to lose people or create enemies. I made another quick decision. I stepped out from the storage room, hands visible, and spoke calmly. "We're just gathering supplies to keep people warm," I said. "There's plenty here for both groups." The men raised their rifles instinctively but didn't fire. The oldest of them, a weathered man in his 50s, studied me for a moment. "You're from the power company," he said, noticing my jacket. "Any chance the grid's coming back on?" I gave him the truth. The infrastructure is too damaged, and there's no one left to repair it. We're on our own." He lowered his rifle slightly. "Where are you holed up?" I hesitated before answering. "A small group at the library. We've got the old coal furnace working." The man exchanged glances with his companions. "We've got 18 people at the church, 6 of them kids. Our generator died this morning." What followed was an unexpected negotiation. The men were from a farming community just outside town. They had food, stored root vegetables, preserved meat, grain, but they were struggling with heat. We had the coal furnace, but limited food supplies. By the time we left the hardware store, we had formed an uneasy alliance. We would share the supplies we'd discovered, and they would trade some of their food. More importantly, we agreed to warn each other about threats and share information. Martinez was skeptical as we drove back to the library with our haul. "Can we trust them?" "We don't have a choice," I replied. "Isolation means death in these conditions. We need allies." Back at the library, our return with supplies was met with relief. The coal had nearly run out, and the temperature in our living space had dropped to near freezing again. We quickly refueled the furnace and began organizing our new supplies. I shared the news about our encounter and the potential alliance with the church group. Reactions were mixed. Some, like Frank and Michael, saw the advantage in numbers and shared resources. Others, particularly Torres, worried about bringing strangers into our relatively secure situation. "We need to be strategic," I explained. "Not everyone can stay here. The space and resources won't support it. But we can coordinate, trade, share knowledge." While this discussion continued, Frank and I turned our attention to the ham radio he had mentioned. We found it in a storage closet covered in dust, but seemingly intact. The equipment was at least 20 years old, but solidly built. It would need power, which meant using some of our precious fuel for a generator, but the potential benefits of communication outweighed the cost. Setting up the radio became my project for the remainder of that day. I cleaned connections, checked wiring, and assessed what we would need to make it operational. Frank found an old antenna on the roof that was still intact, protected from the elements by its design. By evening, we had reorganized our living space to accommodate our new supplies. The central area around the coal furnace was our communal space for meals and meetings. We'd converted the staff break room into a medical area where Michael could treat patients. The reference room became our sleeping area, with makeshift beds created from cushions and blankets. Our 12-person group had developed a natural structure based on skills and experience. I found myself in a leadership position alongside Michael and Patricia, making decisions about resource allocation and planning. Frank handled the furnace and building maintenance. Torres and Martinez managed security and external operations. Aisha had taken on the role of inventory manager, meticulously tracking our supplies and consumption rates. That night, representatives from the church group arrived with the first food exchange: preserved vegetables, some jerky, and flour. In return, we provided coal and kerosene heaters. The meeting was tense but productive. We agreed to daily contact and developed signals to warn each other of potential threats. After they left, we enjoyed our first proper meal in days: a stew made from preserved vegetables and some of our remaining emergency rations. The boost to morale was immediate and significant. Later, as most of the group slept, I continued working on the radio. The familiar work of checking connections and testing circuits kept my mind focused on something other than our dire situation. If I could establish communication with the outside world, we might find more allies, more resources, perhaps even a path to somewhere safer. Ron, the diabetic, sat with me while I worked. He couldn't sleep due to anxiety about his insulin supply. "Even if we survive this cold," he said quietly, "what happens when medications run out? When chronic conditions catch up to people?" It was a sobering question with no easy answer. "We adapt," I told him. "We learn forgotten skills. People managed diabetes before insulin was widely available. It wasn't ideal, but they survived." "By nearly starving themselves," he replied. "By being incredibly careful about diet and exercise," I countered. "Which we will help you do. We're not giving up on anyone." As we talked, I connected the final wires on the radio and prepared to test it using power from a small generator we'd brought from the hardware store. The equipment hummed to life, dials glowing in the dim light. I put on the headphones and began slowly turning the tuning dial, scanning frequencies, listening for any signs of human communication amidst the static. For nearly an hour, I heard nothing but emptiness, a chilling testimony to how many communication systems had already failed. Then, faintly, I caught a voice. I adjusted the tuning carefully, trying to clarify the signal. It was a broadcast, repeating the same message over and over. A weather station from somewhere in the Dakotas, reporting temperatures of 50 below zero and warning people to stay indoors. The broadcast was automated, possibly running on backup power that would eventually fail. I continued scanning and found two more signals, another automated emergency broadcast and what sounded like a private transmission between military units, too faint and encoded to understand. Then, unexpectedly, a clear voice broke through. Someone broadcasting on an emergency frequency, identifying themselves as broadcasting from Springfield, about 80 miles away. They were requesting contact from any functioning government agencies or survivor groups. I hesitated before responding. In this new world, revealing your location and resources could be dangerous, but isolation was equally deadly. I keyed the microphone. "This is Millfield Town Library. We receive you, Springfield." What followed was a brief but critical exchange of information. Their situation mirrored ours: collapsed infrastructure, limited resources, small groups of survivors clustering around heat sources. But they had something we didn't: a doctor with a significant supply of medications salvaged from a pharmacy. We agreed to maintain radio contact at specific times to conserve power. Before signing off, they shared one piece of information that gave us our first glimmer of real hope. Their weather instruments had detected a slight decrease in atmospheric particulate density. It was minimal, but it suggested the ash might be beginning to settle in some areas. As I shut down the radio to conserve fuel, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. We weren't alone. Others were surviving, adapting, finding ways to endure this frozen world. And perhaps, just perhaps, the worst of the cold might eventually pass. We established a routine over the next few days that brought a semblance of normalcy to our lives. Everyone had assigned tasks based on their skills and physical capabilities. We maintained regular radio contact with both the Springfield group and our allies at the church. Information became as valuable as physical supplies in our new reality. I focused on improving our electrical situation. Using parts from the hardware store and my technical knowledge, I constructed a small generator system that could be powered by a stationary bicycle we'd found in the library's staff wellness room. It wasn't much, but it allowed us to charge batteries and operate the radio without depleting our fuel reserves. Frank proved invaluable for his practical knowledge of the library building and town infrastructure. He discovered a rainwater collection system on the roof that had been installed during a green initiative years earlier. Though partially frozen, we could harvest ice from it, melt it using the furnace's heat, and create a sustainable water supply. Patricia, with her mechanical engineering background, worked on improving the efficiency of our heating system. She designed a series of reflective panels using aluminum foil from the kitchen to direct more heat into our living space, and created a ventilation system that distributed warm air more evenly without allowing too much to escape. Aisha continued cataloging our resources and began organizing the library's relevant knowledge. She created a reference system for books on survival, agriculture, medicine, and engineering, making it easier to find information when needed. She also started a journal documenting our experiences and the methods we developed, creating a survival guide for ourselves or anyone who might come after. Michael, our paramedic, faced perhaps the greatest challenges. With limited medical supplies, he had to improvise treatments and focus on preventative care. He taught everyone about the signs of frostbite and hypothermia, proper nutrition with limited food, and maintaining hygiene to prevent disease. His medical area became increasingly organized with carefully labeled supplies and detailed records of each patient's condition. The injured and ill among us were showing improvement. Sarah, the pregnant woman, had regained her strength and was helping with food preparation. David's broken leg was healing, and he contributed by taking inventory shifts while seated. Ron was carefully managing his diabetes through a strictly controlled diet and the minimal physical activity the confined space allowed. Torres and Martinez handled security and external operations, including supply runs and meetings with other survivor groups. They developed a patrol schedule and security protocols, always ensuring at least 2 people were awake and alert at all times. Our daily meals became communal events, opportunities to share information, discuss plans, and maintain morale. We carefully rationed our food, supplemented by trades with the church group. Breakfast was typically a small portion of oatmeal or preserved fruit. Lunch was often skipped or reduced to a small snack. Dinner was our main meal, usually a stew or soup that maximized nutrition while stretching ingredients. Despite our best efforts at efficiency, we faced a constant battle against the cold. The temperature outside remained between 30 and 40 degrees below zero. Inside our living area, we managed to maintain a temperature around 50 degrees near the furnace, dropping to near freezing in the outer areas of our secured zone. We all wore multiple layers at all times and slept huddled in the warmest central area. On our 6th day at the library, we experienced our first major crisis. The exhaust chimney for the coal furnace became partially blocked, causing smoke to back up into the building. Frank identified the problem. Ice had formed inside the chimney, where warm air met the extreme cold, gradually narrowing the opening. Clearing it required someone to go onto the roof in the deadly cold. I volunteered along with Torres. We dressed in every layer we could manage, covered all exposed skin, and used ropes to secure ourselves. The wind on the roof was brutal, cutting through our layers like they weren't there. We worked as quickly as possible using metal rods to break up the ice blockage. The job took less than 20 minutes, but even in our heavy protective gear, we both suffered minor frostbite on our faces and fingers. Michael treated us immediately upon our return, having prepared warm water and blankets. The pain as my frozen skin thawed was excruciating, but we'd avoided serious tissue damage. That evening, we held a council meeting to discuss our longer-term plans. We'd been reacting to immediate needs, but we needed a sustainable strategy. Our biggest concerns are heating fuel, food, and medical supplies, I began. Coal will eventually run out, and there's only so much we can scavenge. Patricia nodded. I've been thinking about alternative heat sources. The library has large south-facing windows. If we could create solar heat collectors, we might supplement the furnace during daylight hours, assuming the ash thins enough to allow some sunlight through. Frank spoke up about food. There's a seed storage facility at the Agricultural Extension Office about a mile from here. They keep heritage seeds for local farmers. If we could get those and create an indoor growing space, Aisha had been researching this very possibility. The library's basement has some areas with access to small windows. If we could rig up growing lights using our generator system, we might be able to grow fast-yielding vegetables, radishes, lettuce, sprouts. The discussion continued late into the night, everyone contributing ideas based on their knowledge and skills. We were no longer just surviving day to day, we were planning for long-term sustainability. It gave us purpose and hope, 2 things as essential as heat and food. The next morning, Martinez, Torres, and I set out for the Agricultural Extension Office. The cold remained brutal, but we'd improved our cold weather gear using techniques found in library books, layering trash bags between fabric layers for wind protection, stuffing gloves and boots with paper for additional insulation. The streets were eerily quiet. Most survivors had established shelters and ventured out only when absolutely necessary. Occasionally, we saw signs of occupation, cleared pathways, smoke from chimneys, faint lights behind covered windows. But we also saw the grim evidence of those who hadn't adapted quickly enough. Houses with broken windows or kicked-in doors, abandoned vehicles containing still forms under layers of ice and snow. At the extension office, we found the building secure but unoccupied. The seed storage was intact, a climate-controlled room that had maintained its temperature for some time after the power failed thanks to excellent insulation. The seeds were carefully organized by type, with detailed growing instructions for each variety. While gathering this precious resource, we heard a noise from another part of the building. Moving cautiously, we discovered a man in his 30s, severely malnourished and suffering from advanced hypothermia. He had been the facility's caretaker, staying behind when others evacuated because he felt responsible for the seed repository. His name was James, and he'd survived by burning furniture and office supplies in a small fireplace, eating from a limited emergency food supply that had finally run out 3 days earlier. He was too weak to travel unassisted, so we carefully wrapped him in our spare layers and brought him back to the library. Michael immediately began treatment for hypothermia and malnutrition. James was dangerously dehydrated and showed signs of frostbite on his extremities, but his condition wasn't as dire as it could have been. His knowledge of agriculture and seed cultivation would prove invaluable if he recovered. That evening, during our scheduled radio contact with Springfield, we received troubling news. A group of armed individuals had attempted to take over their shelter, resulting in casualties on both sides. They had repelled the attack, but were implementing stricter security measures and warned us to do the same. This grim update sparked intense debate among our group. Some advocated for fortifying our position and becoming more selective about who we helped. Others, including Michael, insisted that maintaining our humanity through compassion was essential to true survival. If we turn away everyone who needs help, what are we surviving for? Michael argued. We become no better than animals. Torres disagreed. Resources are finite. Every new person strains what we have. We need to be realistic. The debate had no clear resolution, but we did agree to improve our security. We barricaded all ground-level windows and established a more structured watch rotation. We also developed a code system with the church group to warn each other of potential threats. That night, I took the midnight watch shift. As I sat near one of the few windows we used as observation points, I noticed something unusual. There was a faint distinction between the darkness of the ground and the sky, the first hint of a horizon I'd seen since the ash cloud formed. I watched for nearly an hour, convincing myself I wasn't imagining it. When Frank relieved me, I showed him what I'd observed. "Could be the ash starting to settle," he said cautiously, "or just a temporary thinning." "Either way, it's the first change we've seen," I replied. "If it continues, we might eventually get some sunlight through." That small observation gave me hope as I settled into my makeshift bed. If the ash was beginning to thin or settle, temperatures might eventually moderate. Not enough to return to normal, but perhaps enough to make survival less precarious. As I drifted towards sleep, I found myself thinking about the long term for the first time. Not just surviving this month or the next, but what rebuilding might look like, how communities might reconnect, how knowledge and skills might be preserved and shared, how human ingenuity, when pushed to its limits by catastrophe, might forge new ways of living. The world we knew was gone. But as I looked around at our small group, each contributing their unique skills to our collective survival, I realized something important was taking its place: a more intentional society, where everyone's contribution mattered and nothing was taken for granted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. James would need continued care. Our growing project would need to begin. Security would need strengthening. The furnace would need maintenance. Each day was a complex puzzle of needs and limited resources. But we were solving those puzzles, one day at a time. And in doing so, we were creating a template for whatever world would emerge from this frozen darkness. By our second week in the library, tensions began to surface within our group. The initial sense of unity forged by immediate survival needs was giving way to personality conflicts and disagreements about priorities. We were safe from the elements, had established routines, and now the psychological pressures of confinement and uncertainty were taking their toll. Torres became increasingly paranoid about security, insisting on stricter measures and limitations on who could leave the building and when. His concerns weren't entirely unfounded. We'd heard reports over the radio of violent confrontations in neighboring communities as resources dwindled. But his approach was causing friction, particularly with Michael, who believed our strength came from cooperation rather than isolation. Their disagreement came to a head during our morning meeting when 3 strangers appeared at our door, seeking shelter. They had been traveling for days, trying to reach family in a town 30 miles east. Their car had broken down a mile from Millfield, and they'd walked the rest of the way in the deadly cold. Torres wanted to turn them away immediately. Michael insisted we at least provide temporary shelter and medical attention. The group was divided, with strong opinions on both sides. I found myself in the middle, weighing both perspectives. The strangers, a middle-aged couple and their teenage son, were clearly suffering from exposure and exhaustion. Turning them away might mean their deaths. But Torres wasn't wrong that our resources were limited and carefully calculated for our current numbers. In the end, we compromised. We would shelter them for 3 days, giving them time to recover and gather supplies before continuing their journey. We set clear expectations that this was temporary assistance, not a permanent arrangement. The decision satisfied no one completely, but prevented an irreparable split in our group. I was learning that leadership in this new world wasn't about making perfect choices, but about finding sustainable compromises that kept us functional as a community. The new arrivals introduced themselves as Robert and Linda Chen, and their 17-year-old son, Kevin. They had been visiting family in Iowa when the cold descended and had been trying to get back to their home in eastern Illinois ever since. Their story matched what we knew of the disaster timeline, and their gratitude seemed genuine. Still, Torres insisted on keeping watch on them and limiting their access to our supplies and equipment. I didn't oppose these precautions. Trust was a luxury we couldn't afford to give freely anymore. Kevin, the son, proved surprisingly knowledgeable about electronics and immediately took interest in our generator setup. He suggested modifications that might improve its efficiency, and after some debate, I allowed him to make the changes under my supervision. His innovations increased our output by nearly 20%, allowing us to power essential equipment for longer periods. His parents also contributed during their stay. Robert had been a network engineer and helped us improve our radio antenna for better reception, while Linda, a high school biology teacher, assisted James with setting up our indoor growing operation. Their contributions made Torres' suspicions seem excessive, but I still maintained the 3-day limit we'd agreed upon. Consistency in enforcing our group decisions was essential for maintaining trust. Meanwhile, our alliance with the church group continued to develop. We established a daily check-in system using handheld radios we'd found at the hardware store, conserving batteries by keeping communications brief and at scheduled times. We shared information about security threats, resource discoveries, and survival techniques. We learned they had taken in several families from the school shelter after the situation there deteriorated completely. The school had been abandoned 3 days after we left. its generator fuel exhausted and the building too large to heat by other means. Many had tried to reach larger cities, despite warnings about road conditions. Others had dispersed throughout the town, breaking into homes and businesses for shelter. The situation in Millfield was becoming increasingly fragmented. Small groups occupied whatever buildings offered the best insulation and heat sources. Some cooperated and traded resources. Others turned to raiding and theft. The local police force, now reduced to Chief Williams and 2 officers, could do little to maintain order. On the 9th day at the library, we faced our first direct threat. A group of 5 men approached our building in the early morning, carrying improvised weapons and what appeared to be empty containers for carrying supplies. Torres spotted them during his watch and alerted the rest of us immediately. We had prepared for this possibility. Frank and Patricia quickly dampened the furnace to reduce visible smoke from the chimney. Aisha and Michael moved our most vulnerable members, Sarah, Ron, and David, to a secure storage room we designated as our safe room. The rest of us took positions at strategic points with our own improvised weapons. I approached the front door with Martinez beside me, armed with my crowbar. Through the reinforced glass, I could see the men conferring, pointing at different entry points. Their body language suggested they weren't just seeking help, they were planning how to take what we had. I made a quick decision and stepped outside, closing the door behind me to keep Martinez out of immediate danger. The cold hit like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stand straight, crowbar visible but not raised threateningly. "We have armed people inside," I called to them. "We're willing to trade or offer temporary shelter in exchange for work, but we will defend what's ours." The men hesitated, clearly not expecting direct confrontation. The apparent leader, a tall man with a makeshift spear created from a broom handle and kitchen knife, took a step forward. "We're freezing. We need food and heat," he said. "There's 5 of us and what, 3 or 4 of you? Just let us in, and nobody gets hurt." "There are 12 of us," I lied smoothly, "and we have an alliance with the church group. Any attack on us brings them into it too." This gave them pause. The church group was known to have some hunting rifles. The men conferred briefly, their breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. The leader turned back to me. "We don't want trouble. We just need help." "What skills do you have?" I asked. "What can you contribute?" The question seemed to confuse him. In his mind, need alone justified taking what we had. The concept of contribution or exchange wasn't part of his thinking. "We're strong," he offered finally. "We can do whatever work you need." I shook my head. "We need specific skills: medical, technical, agricultural. And we're at capacity for our space and resources. But we can trade, food for labor, help us gather more supplies, and we'll share what we can." After more discussion among themselves, they agreed to this arrangement. I outlined a job, clearing snow and ice from nearby buildings to search for useful supplies, and promised food upon completion. They seemed dissatisfied but accepted the terms. As they left to begin the work, Martinez joined me outside. "You trust them?" he asked quietly. "No," I replied. "But giving them a controlled way to get what they need is safer than forcing a confrontation. And we do need those buildings checked." I paused, then added, "Double the security watch until we know more about them." The men worked through the day, clearing 3 buildings and returning with some useful items: batteries, canned food, blankets. We provided the promised meal, a larger portion than we'd normally spare, but worth it to establish a non-violent relationship. As they ate in a separate area we'd set up near the entrance, I observed them carefully. Their dynamics were revealing. 2 seemed genuinely grateful for the food and opportunity. The leader and 1 other appeared to be scanning our defenses, noting entrances and resources. The 5th man, younger than the others, seemed simply lost, following whoever offered direction. After they left with arrangements to return the next day for more work, Torres confronted me. "They're going to come back at night," he predicted. "They were casing us the whole time." I nodded. "I know. That's why we're setting up a false target." With the help of Kevin, the teenager staying with us, we created the impression of our main supply storage being in the reference room on the first floor, visible but secured with an elaborate lock. In reality, we moved our critical supplies to the basement archive room, accessible only through a staff entrance that could be easily defended. Sure enough, around 2 in the morning, our motion sensors, created from strings attached to cans with pebbles inside, alerted us to intruders. The leader and 2 others had returned, breaking in through a window we'd intentionally left less secured than the others. We allowed them to break into the false storage room, then trapped them inside by jamming the door shut from the outside. They had walked right into our ambush without a shot fired or a blow struck. When morning came, we gave them a choice: leave town permanently or work legitimately with our group under strict supervision. Surprisingly, 2 chose to stay, including the younger man I'd noticed earlier. The leader refused any cooperation and left when we released him, making vague threats about returning. We learned from the 2 who stayed that more desperate groups were forming in the surrounding rural areas. Farms were running out of stored food, and heating fuel was critically low everywhere. Our library, with its visible chimney smoke, was becoming a known location with resources worth taking. This information forced us to reassess our security and alliance strategy. We needed more allies, better defenses, and a coordinated approach to dealing with threats. The next day, I arranged a meeting with representatives from the church group and 3 other small survivor communities we'd identified through our radio communications. Winter hadn't just changed our environment. It had transformed human relationships. Trust, contribution, and resource sharing were becoming the foundation of a new social order. Those who understood this were forming communities that might survive. Those who resorted to pure self-interest or predatory behavior were increasingly isolated and desperate. As our second week in the library came to an end, I realized we were witnessing the initial formation of whatever society would emerge from this disaster. The rules were being written through our daily decisions and interactions. Would cooperation or conflict define this new frozen world? The answer would determine not just who survived, but what kind of world the survivors would inhabit. That night, as I took my turn at watch, I noticed strange lights in the western sky during a rare moment of clarity in the ash cloud. They weren't stars or planes, more like a greenish shimmer that pulsed and moved. Aurora borealis, visible this far south because of the atmospheric changes. Beautiful and alien, a reminder that Earth itself was transforming around us in ways we were only beginning to understand. By the beginning of our third week, the psychological toll of our situation became impossible to ignore. Lisa, one of our original 12, began showing signs of severe anxiety that progressed rapidly to a full breakdown. She had been quiet and dependable, handling inventory alongside Aisha. But one morning she simply couldn't get out of her makeshift bed. When Michael tried to help her, she became hysterical, screaming about how we were all going to die, how the cold would never end. Her breakdown affected everyone. The reality we'd been fighting through determination and busy work suddenly felt inescapable. If Lisa, who had seemed so stable, could crack, any of us could be next. Michael sedated her with medication from our limited supply, but we all knew this was a temporary solution to a deeper problem. That same day, our food inventory reached a critical threshold. Aisha's meticulous records showed we had perhaps 5 days of adequate nutrition remaining, even with strict rationing. Our growing operation wasn't producing enough yet to supplement significantly. We needed to find more food immediately. Torres suggested a raid on the abandoned supermarket at the edge of town. We'd avoided it previously because it would likely have been the first place others targeted, and the large open space would be impossible to heat, meaning any food left would be frozen solid. But desperation pushed options previously dismissed back onto the table. Martinez, Torres, and I prepared for the expedition while the others maintained the library. We dressed in our improvised extreme weather gear, loaded our sleds, constructed from bookshelves and plastic sheeting, and armed ourselves as best we could. Kevin, the teenager who had stayed with us after his parents continued their journey, insisted on joining us. His knowledge of electronics had proven valuable, and he argued convincingly that another pair of hands would allow us to transport more supplies. The temperature outside remained brutally cold, though our weather tracking suggested it had stabilized rather than continuing to drop. The thermometer read 32 below zero as we set out, with a wind that made it feel even colder. The journey to the supermarket took nearly an hour through snow-choked streets. We passed other survivor shelters, some showing signs of ongoing occupation, others ominously silent and dark. Twice we diverted our route to avoid groups of people who looked more like scavengers than organized survivors. The supermarket parking lot was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles, many still containing the frozen remains of those who had sought shelter in the early days before understanding the true deadliness of the cold. We averted our eyes and focused on our mission. The store's main entrance had been shattered as expected. Inside, the scene was one of devastation. Initial panic buying had emptied many shelves before the cold hit. What remained had been picked over by earlier scavengers. Frozen products scattered across floors suggested hasty looting. We split into teams, Martinez and Kevin taking dry goods, Torres and I focusing on the storage areas and pharmacy. We worked methodically, checking every shelf, freezer, and storage cabinet. The pharmacy had been thoroughly looted of anything with recreational value or obvious medical use, but we found a stock of vitamins, electrolyte solutions, and basic first aid supplies that had been overlooked. In the employee break room, we discovered a vending machine that had been abandoned after someone managed to break the glass but could only reach some of the contents. The remaining chips and candy weren't nutritionally ideal, but they represented concentrated calories we desperately needed. Our most significant find came in the loading dock area. A delivery truck had been partially unloaded when the disaster struck. Behind a fallen stack of pallets, we found cases of canned vegetables and fruit that had been missed by previous scavengers. It was enough food to sustain our group for at least 2 additional weeks. As we were loading our sleds, Kevin called out from the manager's office where he'd been checking for supplies. He'd found a stash of emergency equipment including hand-crank radios, chemical heat packs, and, most valuable of all, a satellite phone. The device was dead, but Kevin was confident he could recharge it using our generator system. If he succeeded, we might be able to contact government emergency services or other survivor groups beyond our radio range. Our return journey was tense but uneventful. The heavily loaded sleds moved slowly through the snow, and we rotated pulling duty to avoid exhaustion in the dangerous cold. Every one of us suffered some degree of frostbite on exposed facial skin despite our best precautions. When we finally reached the library, the mood inside had deteriorated further. Lisa's condition had worsened. She had become completely non-responsive, refusing food and water. Michael was deeply concerned about her survival if this continued. More troubling, a conflict had erupted between Ron, our diabetic, and Patricia over resource allocation. Ron had discovered Patricia giving extra food to Sarah, the pregnant woman, without logging it in the inventory. Though the additional nutrition for Sarah was medically justified, the breach of our strict rationing protocols had created a sense of favoritism and inequality that threatened our cohesion. I called an immediate group meeting to address both situations. The food we'd brought back temporarily eased tensions around resources, but Lisa's breakdown forced us to confront the psychological reality of our situation. We need to acknowledge what we're all feeling, I said to the group gathered around the furnace. The fear, the uncertainty, the grief for what we've lost. Pretending we're fine doesn't help anyone. What followed was our most honest conversation since the disaster began. People shared their darkest fears, dying from cold or starvation, never seeing loved ones again, living in this frozen world forever. Some admitted having thoughts similar to Lisa's, questioning whether survival was even worth the constant struggle. Michael, drawing on his medical training, explained that what we were experiencing was a normal response to trauma and extreme stress. He suggested creating a daily ritual where people could express their fears in a controlled setting rather than suppressing them until they became overwhelming. Frank, who had been quieter than usual in recent days, spoke up. I've been alive 62 years, seen a lot of hard times. The ones who make it through aren't always the strongest or smartest. They're the ones who find meaning beyond just staying alive. His words resonated deeply. We had been so focused on physical survival that we'd neglected the human need for purpose. We decided to allocate time each day not just for practical work, but for teaching each other skills, sharing knowledge, recording our experiences, and even allowing for creative expression through writing or art using library materials. That night, Kevin began working on the satellite phone, meticulously cleaning connections and constructing a charging system. The possibility of wider communication gave everyone something to look forward to, a concrete hope to focus on. I took the midnight watch as I often did, finding the quiet hours conducive to planning and reflection. The library had become more than just a shelter. It was evolving into a community with its own culture and values. Despite the breakdown in wider society, we were creating something meaningful on a small scale. Around 2 a.m, I noticed a flashing light from the direction of the church where our allies were based. It was a warning signal we'd established, 3 quick flashes repeated 3 times. I woke Torres and Martinez immediately. The signal meant urgent danger requiring assistance. We had to respond, both to honor our alliance and because their security was ultimately linked to ours. We dressed quickly and armed ourselves with the most effective weapons we had. The crowbar for me, an axe for Torres, and a makeshift spear for Martinez. The bitter cold outside seemed to burn through our protective layers instantly. The church was nearly half a mile away. We ran as best we could through the deep snow, our breath freezing into ice crystals on our face coverings. As we approached, we could see flickering light inside, not the steady glow of their normal heating, but the erratic movement of multiple flashlights. The front door was open, snow blowing into the entrance. Inside, we found chaos. A group of raiders had broken in through the back entrance where the building's old stone foundation had crumbled slightly. 2 of the church group were injured, one seriously with what appeared to be a stab wound. The raiders had been driven back, but not before stealing critical medical supplies and food. According to the church group's leader, Pastor Wilson, they had fled toward the eastern edge of town. We helped stabilize the injured and secure the building before returning to the library. This attack changed our security calculations significantly. The raiders had been organized and strategic, targeting specific resources rather than randomly looting. They had also shown a willingness to use potentially lethal violence. Back at the library, I called another meeting despite the early hour. Everyone needed to understand our new reality. The situation in town is deteriorating, I explained. Resources are running out everywhere, and some groups are turning to violence. We need to strengthen our defenses immediately. We spent the rest of the night implementing additional security measures, barricading windows more thoroughly, establishing an early warning system similar to the church's, and creating defensive positions inside the building in case of breach. As dawn approached, bringing its slight lightening of the perpetual gray, Kevin called me over to where he was still working on the satellite phone. His expression was grim. "I've got it powered up," he said, "but I can't get a signal. Either the satellites are down or the atmospheric conditions are blocking transmission." It was a devastating setback. The hope of outside contact had been sustaining many of us through the darkest moments. Now that hope was gone, at least temporarily. That morning, as I finally tried to get some rest after the long night, I found myself questioning every decision I'd made since the disaster began. Had I led our group down a path that ultimately couldn't succeed? Were we just postponing the inevitable? As I drifted into an exhausted sleep, I dreamed of the power grid I'd worked on for so many years, the interconnected systems that had once kept civilization running smoothly. In my dream, I was trying desperately to repair broken connections while the cold crept ever closer, freezing each section as soon as I fixed it. I woke with a start several hours later, my mind strangely clear despite the minimal rest. We couldn't win by just defending what we had. We needed to rebuild connections, create a network of survivor groups large enough to secure and share resources effectively. Isolation meant eventual death. Integration meant potential survival. The idea crystallized into a plan that would either ensure our long-term survival or lead to our downfall. Either way, it was time to take a risk. The alternative was slowly watching our resources and hope dwindle until nothing remained. I called our entire group together that afternoon to present my plan. Some were still recovering from the night's events, but everyone understood the urgency of our situation. "We need to establish a network," I explained, sketching a rough map of the town on a whiteboard we'd salvaged from the library's community room. "Right now, we have small groups scattered throughout Millfield, each struggling individually. Some cooperate, some compete, some raid. But none of us can survive long-term in isolation." I outlined my vision: a confederation of survivor groups, each maintaining their separate shelters but coordinating defense, sharing specialized skills, and pooling resources when necessary. The library would serve as a central hub due to our radio equipment and central location. "This isn't just about pooling physical resources," I continued. "It's about combining knowledge and skills. The church group has hunting experience. The family in the hardware store knows tool repair. The former nurses at the dental office have medical skills that complement Michael's. Together, we're stronger than the sum of our parts." The reaction was mixed. Some, like Michael and Aisha, immediately supported the idea. Others, particularly Torres, saw it as an unnecessary risk. "We've managed to secure what we need," Torres argued. "Opening our doors to more people means spreading our resources thinner." "Our resources are finite," I countered. "The coal will run out. The canned food will run out. But knowledge and skills can multiply. If we can create systems for growing food indoors, harvesting water efficiently, generating power without fuel, and defending our perimeter collectively, we have a chance at long-term survival." The debate continued for hours. Lisa's breakdown had made everyone acutely aware of the psychological cost of our isolation. Even Torres couldn't deny that having more people would allow for better security rotations and reduce the individual burden of critical tasks. Eventually, we took a vote. The result was 7 in favor, 3 against, and 2 abstentions. We would proceed with reaching out to other survivor groups to form an alliance. Kevin had continued working on the satellite phone throughout our discussion. As we concluded, he called me over with excitement in his voice for the first time in days. "I've got something," he said. "Not a full signal, but I'm picking up fragments of data transmission. There's still some satellite function." This small success energized the group. If we could establish communication beyond our immediate area, we might gain critical information about conditions elsewhere, potential safe zones, or government recovery efforts. The next morning, Martinez, Michael, and I set out to meet with the church group and present our alliance proposal. The temperature had risen slightly to around 25 below zero, still deadly, but manageable, with proper preparation. The sky seemed marginally brighter as well, suggesting the ash might indeed be settling in some areas. Pastor Wilson and his core group received us cautiously but with interest. The attack had shaken their sense of security, and our assistance during the crisis had strengthened our relationship. I laid out the same plan I'd presented to our group. We're not suggesting combining our shelters, I clarified. Each group maintains their independence but agrees to a mutual defense pact, resource-sharing protocols, and regular knowledge exchange. Pastor Wilson was particularly interested in our growing operation. His group had more people to feed and less technical knowledge about indoor agriculture. In return, they offered hunting expertise and access to a better preserved food storage area they'd discovered beneath the church. After lengthy discussion, they agreed to the alliance in principle, with details to be worked out in the coming days. This initial success gave us momentum to approach other groups. Over the next 3 days, we met with 5 other survivor communities in Millfield. Not all were immediately receptive, but the church group's endorsement lent credibility to our proposal. By the end of the 3rd day, we had secured tentative agreements from 4 of the 5 groups. The 5th, a particularly well-armed group occupying the town's former bank building, declined our offer but agreed to neutral terms. They wouldn't raid or interfere with alliance members if we respected their territory. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than active hostility. During this diplomatic effort, Kevin continued working on the satellite phone with increasing success. He had managed to receive fragmentary transmissions that suggested organized response efforts were underway in certain regions. Most critically, he intercepted part of a meteorological report indicating a significant decrease in atmospheric particulate density in the western states. On our 4th day of alliance building, as we returned from successfully recruiting a group of former factory workers who had mechanical skills, we received our first coherent transmission on the satellite phone. The signal was weak and broke up frequently, but the message was clear enough. A government research facility in Colorado was operational, with sustainable heat, food production, and power. They were accepting survivors who could contribute needed skills. The transmission included an emergency broadcast frequency for contacting the facility. We immediately adjusted our radio to the specified frequency and sent a message identifying our location and group composition, emphasizing our technical skills and successful community organization. The response came hours later. They had received our transmission and confirmed that our location was within their operational range for potential evacuation. However, they were prioritizing groups with specific technical expertise needed for their long-term sustainability projects. When I mentioned my background in power grid infrastructure and our group's success in adapting electrical systems for survival, their interest noticeably increased. They requested a more detailed inventory of our skills and current capabilities. I called an emergency meeting to share this development with our group. The reaction was mixed. Excitement at the prospect of a more secure environment competing with fear of the dangerous journey, and suspicion about the facility's true nature. "How do we know this isn't a trap?" Torres asked. "Or some kind of government experiment?" It was a reasonable concern. In this new world, trust had become as precious as heat. "We don't know for certain," I acknowledged. "But we do know our current situation is unsustainable long-term. The coal will eventually run out. Our food production isn't sufficient, and we've seen that the social situation in town is deteriorating." Michael, who had been checking on Lisa's condition, joined the discussion. "Lisa isn't improving," he said quietly. "She needs specialized psychological care we can't provide, and Ron's insulin will be gone within 2 weeks. This facility might have the medical resources they need? The mention of our most vulnerable members shifted the conversation. We all understood that despite our best efforts, some needs simply couldn't be met with our limited resources. If we go, Patricia asked, what about the alliance we've been building? Do we just abandon these people? It was a question that cut to the heart of our values. Had we been building connections only to save ourselves, or did we have a responsibility to the community we'd helped create? After hours of discussion, we reached a compromise. We would send a small team to verify the Colorado facility's legitimacy and potential. If it proved viable, we would return for the rest of our group and extend the opportunity to our alliance members based on the facility's capacity and requirements. The next decision was more difficult. Who would go and who would stay? The journey would be extremely dangerous, requiring specialized knowledge for survival in the frozen landscape and mechanical skills to handle vehicle issues. At the same time, the library needed its core team to maintain operations and continue building the alliance. Various factors were considered: essential skills for the journey versus essential skills for the library, physical condition, and personal choice. Eventually, we settled on a team of 4, myself, due to my power infrastructure knowledge that the facility specifically valued, Martinez for his mechanical abilities, Kevin for his electronics expertise, and, somewhat surprisingly, Frank, who insisted his lifetime of practical skills would be invaluable on the road. Those staying behind would be led by Patricia and Michael, continuing our alliance-building efforts and maintaining the library as a community hub. If we didn't return or make contact within 30 days, they would assume the worst and proceed accordingly. The satellite phone would go with our team, while the radio equipment would remain at the library. We established a communication schedule and emergency protocols. As we made these plans, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come from those first desperate days. We had created something meaningful from chaos, not just survival, but the beginnings of a new kind of community based on interdependence and shared knowledge. That night, during my watch shift, I observed the sky more carefully than usual. The stars weren't visible yet, but the darkness had subtle variations in density. In one section of the western sky, I could make out what might have been the moon's glow diffusing through the ash layer. It wasn't much, but it represented the possibility of change, of improvement, however gradual. I wrote detailed instructions for maintaining our electrical systems, charging methods, and generator operation, organizing them in a binder for those staying behind. Knowledge transfer had become a form of legacy in this new world, passing on what you knew might be the most valuable contribution anyone could make. As I worked, I heard the radio pick up a partial transmission on the emergency frequency. Through the static, these words came through clearly. Atmospheric clearing in sectors 5 and 6. Temperature increase of 3 degrees recorded. It wasn't much, but it was the first concrete evidence that conditions might be improving somewhere. Whether it would reach us in time to matter remained to be seen. But the journey west suddenly seemed to offer not just the hope of a better shelter, but potentially of a world beginning, ever so slightly, to heal. We spent our final 3 days at the library in intense preparation. The journey to Colorado would cover approximately 900 miles through terrain that had been transformed into a frozen wasteland. Every aspect required careful planning to maximize our chances of survival. The vehicle choice was critical. We selected our utility truck, which had 4-wheel drive, high clearance, and most importantly, was designed for winter conditions. Martinez conducted a complete mechanical inspection, replacing questionable parts with components scavenged from abandoned vehicles around town. We installed a small wood-burning stove in the truck bed, which we enclosed with an insulated shell created from materials found at the hardware store. The stove would serve as our primary heat source during rest periods, allowing us to turn off the engine and conserve fuel. We calculated that even with additional gas cans, fuel would be our most limiting factor. Our route was planned meticulously using the library's atlas collection. We would avoid major cities, which our radio reports suggested had become danger zones of desperate survivors and depleted resources. Instead, we would follow rural highways, stopping at small towns only when necessary for supplies or shelter. Food and water planning was equally critical. We prepared high-calorie, compact rations, vacuum-sealed using equipment from the school's home economics classroom. Water would be obtained by melting snow and ice, with purification tablets from the hardware store's camping section to ensure safety. Each of us prepared specialized equipment related to our skills. I packed tools for electrical work, including insulated gloves, voltage testers, and a basic soldering kit. Martinez focused on mechanical tools and parts for vehicle maintenance. Kevin organized electronic equipment, including solar charging panels and battery storage. Frank, true to his practical nature, assembled a comprehensive survival kit with equipment for fire starting, shelter building, and basic medical care. The most difficult preparations, however, were emotional rather than practical. Those staying behind tried to maintain brave faces, but the uncertainty of our return weighed heavily. We recorded detailed instructions for maintaining the library systems and continuing the Alliance work, but everyone understood these might become final messages. I spent time with each member of our core group, ensuring they understood their responsibilities, but also expressing my genuine appreciation for their contributions. These people, strangers just a month ago, had become something like family through our shared struggle. Michael pulled me aside the evening before our departure. "Lisa is still not improving," he said quietly, "and Ron has maybe 10 days of insulin left. I've been stretching it as much as medically possible." "If the Colorado facility is legitimate," I assured him, "we'll send help back immediately. Focus on keeping everyone alive until then." He nodded, his expression grim but determined. "I've been teaching Aisha basic medical procedures. She's a quick learner." These quiet moments of knowledge transfer had become our most important ritual. In a world where survival knowledge was currency, teaching others ensured that critical skills wouldn't die with any individual. The morning of our departure arrived with a subtle change in the atmosphere. The temperature had risen slightly to around 20 below zero, and the perpetual gray had a hint of brighter diffusion toward the west. We took it as a promising sign. We loaded the last of our supplies into the truck while the remaining group gathered to see us off. Torres, who had been the most vocal opponent of the journey, approached me with an unexpected gesture. He handed me his prized hunting knife, a high-quality blade he'd carried since our first day. "For the road," he said simply. "It's better than that utility knife you packed." I accepted it with a nod, understanding the significance of the gift. Despite our disagreements, a bond had formed that transcended our different approaches to survival. Pastor Wilson and representatives from other alliance groups also came to witness our departure and provide last-minute contributions. Additional food, a better map of the Western territories one of them had traveled before the disaster, and a small bottle of precious antibiotics from the nurses at the dental office. Our final preparations complete, we gathered for one last moment together. No one gave speeches. We'd said what needed saying in our private conversations. Instead, Frank surprised everyone by producing a small journal he'd been keeping since the disaster began. "This stays here," he said, handing it to Patricia. "Keep adding to it. Write down what works, what doesn't, how people adapt, how society rebuilds. This record might be the most important thing any of us leave behind." The simplicity and wisdom of his gesture moved everyone. In a world where physical comfort had become so precious, Frank understood that knowledge preservation might ultimately matter more to human survival than any immediate comfort. With final embraces and promises to return if possible, we departed just after dawn. The truck moved slowly through the snow-covered streets of Millfield, past buildings that had become familiar landmarks in our new reality. The school where we'd first sheltered, the hardware store that had provided crucial supplies, the church where our alliance had begun. As we reached the town limits, I looked back at the library, its brick structure solid against the white landscape, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Whatever happened to us on this journey, I took comfort knowing we'd created something meaningful there. Not just a shelter, but the beginning of a new community built on interdependence and shared knowledge. The first day of travel proved even more challenging than anticipated. Many roads were completely impassable, buried under snowdrifts or blocked by abandoned vehicles. Martinez's driving skills were tested as we navigated through fields and occasional stretches of clearer highway. We covered only 40 miles that first day, far less than the 100 we'd hoped for. At this rate, the journey would take nearly a month, and our supplies wouldn't last. We needed to find more efficient routes or increase our daily distance. That night, we parked in the lee of an abandoned barn for shelter from the wind. The wood stove provided adequate heat in our enclosed truck bed, allowing us to rest in relative comfort. We established a watch rotation, each taking 3 hours to monitor our surroundings and maintain the fire. During my watch, I used the satellite phone to attempt contact with the Colorado facility. The connection was poor, but I managed to transmit our coordinates and estimated travel time. Their response was fragmented but contained one clear instruction: proceed to Grand Island for supply cache and updated route information. This specific directive increased my confidence in the facility's legitimacy. They weren't just broadcasting generic messages. They were coordinating actual logistics for survivors. The second day brought marginally better conditions. The temperature continued its slight warming trend, now around 15 degrees below zero. More importantly, we discovered that the interstate, while initially clogged with abandoned vehicles near towns, had sections that had been partially cleared, allowing for faster travel. By evening of the second day, we'd covered nearly 80 miles, a significant improvement but still concerning given our limited fuel. We needed to find additional gasoline, or our journey would end far short of Colorado. The opportunity came on the third day when we approached a small service station on the outskirts of a rural town. The building was intact, with no signs of occupation. Martinez circled cautiously before we approached, wary of potential ambush. The station's underground tanks still contained fuel, but with no electricity, we had no way to pump it conventionally. This is where my technical knowledge proved valuable. Using parts from the truck and the station's existing infrastructure, I created a manual pumping system that allowed us to extract the precious gasoline. While working, Kevin discovered something unexpected in the station's storage room: a ham radio set, still operational on battery power. The station owner had apparently been a radio enthusiast. Kevin quickly established contact with a network of operators who had maintained communication throughout the disaster. The information we gathered was transformative. There were organized survivor communities throughout the Midwest and Western states, many with specialized knowledge or resources. The Ice Age wasn't affecting all regions equally. The Western states were already seeing temperature increases of several degrees as ash began to settle or disperse in the upper atmosphere. Most critically, we received confirmation about the Colorado facility. It was legitimate. A government research installation focused on sustainable living technologies that had been repurposed as a survivor community. Several ham operators had direct contact with people who had successfully reached it. This verification energized our team. We weren't chasing a rumor or potential trap. The destination was real, with resources that could save our Millfield community if we could reach it and secure assistance. With our fuel tanks filled and new information in hand, we continued westward with renewed determination. The landscape remained alien and hostile, familiar terrain transformed by snow and ice into something unrecognizable. Occasionally, we passed evidence of those who hadn't survived, vehicles containing still forms, abandoned homesteads with doors left open to the killing cold. But we also began to see signs of adaptation and survival. Farms with chimneys actively smoking, using alternative heat sources. Small communities with sentries posted, indicating organization and purpose. Ingenious wind barriers created from available materials. Humanity was fighting back against the frozen apocalypse, using creativity and determination to carve out existence in the new reality. On our 5th day, we reached Grand Island, Nebraska, where the Colorado facility had indicated a supply cache would be located. Following their coordinates, we found an unmarked warehouse on the town's industrial edge. Inside, true to their word, was a carefully organized cache of supplies: fuel, food, mechanical parts, and most crucially, detailed maps showing cleared routes to the facility. This discovery eliminated any lingering doubts. The operation was sophisticated and organized, suggesting substantial resources and long-term planning. We resupplied according to the instructions provided, leaving documentation of our visit as requested. That night, as we prepared for the next leg of our journey, I used the satellite phone to contact the library in Millfield. The connection was surprisingly clear, allowing a brief but meaningful conversation with those we'd left behind. Patricia reported that the Alliance was holding strong, with 2 additional groups joining since our departure. Resources were being shared effectively, and knowledge exchange had begun in earnest, with different groups teaching their specialized skills to others. The temperature had risen slightly in their region as well, matching our observations of gradual warming. However, she also shared concerning news. Lisa's condition had worsened, and Ron was showing signs of distress as his insulin supplies dwindled. The broader town situation was deteriorating as well, with increased reports of raids and violence from desperate groups outside the Alliance. I promised to expedite our journey and send help as soon as possible. After ending the call, I shared the update with my teammates. We unanimously agreed to push harder, increasing our daily travel despite the risks of exhaustion and mechanical stress on the vehicle. The next 3 days passed in a blur of constant movement, stopping only when absolutely necessary for rest or maintenance. The landscape gradually changed as we moved westward, still snow-covered but with subtle variations in the sky. The perpetual gray developed patches where lighter blue occasionally showed through, and the western horizon had a definite brightness compared to the east. On the morning of our 9th day, we crested a hill in eastern Colorado and saw something none of us had witnessed in a month. Direct sunlight, breaking through a thin spot in the ash layer, and touching the snowy landscape with gold. It lasted only minutes before the ash shifted and obscured it again, but the brief glimpse brought tears to my eyes. The world was healing, however slowly. The question was whether our fragile human communities could endure long enough to see it recover. As we approach the coordinates of the Colorado facility today, I'm recording this account of our first month in the global ice age. I don't know what we'll find when we arrive, whether they'll have resources to help our people in Millfield, or whether the gradual warming we've observed will continue or reverse. What I do know is that humans are remarkably adaptable when necessity demands it. In 1 month, we've created new communities, rediscovered old skills, established new values based on knowledge and contribution, and found ways to endure what seemed unsurvivable. If you're watching this, it means some form of civilization continues. Remember what allowed us to survive. Not just technical skills or practical knowledge, though those were essential, but our willingness to cooperate, to share resources, to value each person's contribution. The greatest threat wasn't the cold or food scarcity, but isolation and the belief that individual survival trumped community. I see the facility in the distance now, solar arrays gleaming in the filtered light. Whatever happens next, I know that somewhere, people like those we left in Millfield are rebuilding society one connection at a time. In that network of human cooperation lies our true power, more sustainable than any electrical grid I ever worked on. This is Ezekiel Whitaker, Powerline technician and survivor, signing off as we begin the next chapter of this frozen journey.